I have a statement about 3 Americans, presumably they're Christians, who were arrested and now they have been released and deported because they were accused of proselytizing and promoting Christianity. Well, if they were defaming Islam, I think they deserve to be deported. I don't know what their actual offense was, but these are very serious questions which I think are troubling to Christians, because things are being done in the name of religion that don't seem to agree with what we are saying publicly about freedom of religion.
I think that issue goes back to one of the points I raised in the very beginning on the question of methodology. And one of the points I tried to emphasize, and I'm sure my Christian brethren also would insist on that distinction as well, is to make a clear distinction between the teachings of the faith as authenticated, especially in its revelatory sources, and the practice of people who claim to be Muslims. Just to bring the point home quicker, you can understand what kind of image of Christianity would be if one were to understand Christianity in view of the Crusades, Inquisition, World Wars, crime, Nazism, and fascism, which all happened to arise in countries that were labeled by others as Christian countries. I think that's an honest and clear distinction that we really should keep in mind, and I'd like to reiterate what I said earlier. It is Muslims who are to be judged by the standard of the revelatory sources, not Islam to be judged by their behavior, and I'm sure that you'd be interested also in applying the same rule to Christians. One of the most common misconceptions in the West is that some countries that claim to be applying Sharia is taken, I'm not talking about the people, at least governments, are taken really as on face value, even though in many cases what is being applied is some aspects of Sharia. Just to give you one example, on those monarchies that you mentioned, alluded to, whether it's Saudi Arabia or others, when it suits them, they say we'll apply Sharia. But when you tell them Sharia requires that the ruler should be freely elected by the people, or that according to Sharia people must have an input in the decision-making, political decision-making process, or even, as you have said, and I heard that news with amazement, even though it didn't sound strange to me coming from the Saudi government, when people are banned because they said, let's have a human rights commission, which is very consistent with Islam, that aspect of Sharia perhaps is not relevant to them. This is what I call a self-serving, selective application of Sharia whenever it suits them. Let me tell you one thing, again, to just not put it rhetorically. In the matter of even people speaking about their religion or explaining what is good about their religion to others, do you know that this happened even in the time of Prophet Muhammad himself in his own mosque in Medina? When the Christians, the deputation from Najran, which is now in Yemen, came to him and they dialogued in the mosque, and obviously they spoke about their belief in Jesus. And there is record even that when the time of prayer came, he allowed them to have their own prayers in his own masjid. So what I'm saying again, the clear distinction between this self-serving type of claim of implementation, which they are to be judged by the standards rather than the reverse. And secondly, to be honest also, I mentioned something very briefly, but that would be more relevant to the issue of minority, that even when you look at jurisprudential interpretation by jurists in history, even though there have been differences of opinion here and there, many times also you find there are interpretations that are quite questionable, even though they have been quite common, and that's why you get very important dissenting opinion, and we'll hear some of this in the minority issue.
Could I make a brief response? I appreciate very much what you have said, Professor Badawi, and would be the first to acknowledge that Christians have violated their own standards. But today, as we learn in and through the ecumenical movement and the growing together of Christians and the fact that we are in dialogue and in fellowship with Christian brothers and sisters in many third world countries, we have learned that when their rights are violated, as they have been in let's say, in South Africa or in El Salvador or in Argentina and Brazil, that we must protest on behalf of the whole Christian community. We cannot be silent. We must make clear that these are clear violations of rights which the world Christian community simply will not tolerate. We may be powerless to do anything about it in the moment, but I think as an important principle, we have to find ways whereby we can express our conscience on these matters and not be silent about them.
I fully agree with you, and I have absolutely no problem with that. But let me also just add one humble little thing just to clarify, that whenever there is oppression, historically or now, it has been oppression applied against both Muslims and non-Muslims. You're talking about people who have been expelled for what the authorities saw as an offense. But in the very same country, let's get a Muslim who belongs to a great majority, to the 99.9, stand up and say, I respectfully disagree with the policy of King Faisal, or King Fahd in this issue. He would be much more severely punished than a non-Muslim. In most cases, he will disappear behind the sun, as the Egyptian used to say when Nasir, that a person might never be heard of. And I heard it from some Saudis myself, who confided in me, that some of the dissenters are taken sometimes and thrown from helicopters in the quicksand. Nobody hears of them. So I think the persecution is for both, and persecution of Muslims by those tyrants is even much greater than their mistreatment of non-Muslims.
One of the respected doctors here raised the issue that Muslims can preach their religion in Christian countries, but vice versa is not true. Like, we don't have a true Muslims in anywhere around the world now that we just have one good example that they allow others to preach their religion peacefully without any war or weapons.
Example from Muslims?
Yes, example for any Muslim country.
I happen just to come from Sudan, about which there have been a great deal of distortion I've seen in the media. I have been shocked myself to see what is happening there and compare it to what the media is saying about them. And instead of just putting it in my words, I'll give you a few words very quickly from a statement made by Reverend Philo Theos Faraj, who is the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church in Sudan. Very quickly. He says, first of all, in our history, no church has been converted into a mosque. In our ancient history, in all our ancient and modern history, there were no incident or act against a church or mosque. The cost of lights of our churches are paid by the government. Our private and personal jurisdiction, the personal law, marriage, divorce, and inheritance, is left totally under our jurisdiction without interference from the government. Churches and mosques are built on land granted by the government. In the Khartoum Central Station, the Bible Society Library opened its door for all. And then he says that the Bible Society operates in full freedom, and even under the auspices of the Minister of Information, there is this floating exhibition of Christian literature. The Christian have a place in mass media, in radio, television, and newspaper. And Reverend Faraj himself gave me copies, Xerox copies, of some of the columns that is allowed to publish even in the government paper. And obviously speak about Christian concept and in a way showing the goodness in Christianity, in a way inviting others to it. The Christian syllabus for teaching children, Christian children, is done by a committee of the church and printed under the cost and the government printing presses. These are not my words, and I have the full statement of his paper that he presented.
If you would like to comment on this important issue, because as people live in America, that contradicts what Dr. Badawi said to me, contradicts what I hear on the media, newspaper, and everything. So I assume that all of those are wrong?
Absolutely not. I think we need to publicize such cases and distinguish between violations and happy examples of religious communities working together in mutual respect.
Okay, let me try some more of the question here.
There was something before, but you didn't answer about slavery.
Oh, you just read my mind.
May I just say a word or two?
Sure.
I certainly cannot take exception to the material you presented. All I can say, however, is that in the Catholic community, we have been presented with some very vivid testimony by the bishop from southern Sudan, and I emphasize southern Sudan, because the situation about which he speaks applies primarily to that part of the country, where he has spoken quite strongly about the dangers of the imposition of the government attempt